It's a real pleasure to have Courtney with us, Dr. Courtney from Canada, a leading figure in the planetary health community, in the steering board of the Planetary Health Alliance, also in the board of the Lancet Planetary Health, among many other things, and an awesome emergency doctor in Yellowknife and Subotic, and most especially with 2 kids, right? Yeah, so thank you very much for joining, Courtney, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure always to connect with colleagues around problem solving in different parts of the world. Enrique, can you enable the screen sharing right now?
I'm not sure how I do it.
Are you the host?
Okay, I'll do it. We are co-hosts. Okay, go ahead.
Well done, well done. Okay, here we go. So I know that everybody in this group knows how to explain planetary health, but I find that most of the audiences and decision makers I speak with right now don't know what the term is, and in fact have a different view of health. And so what I'm going to present first is just a quick way that I explain this to lay audiences and decision makers in case it's helpful to you. And the image here is in the supplement for this article. And so I describe it as a planetary health nest. People can envision nests as a nurturing place to keep people safe. And so how I describe it is that the ecological determinants of health, things like soil, water, climate, are the structure of the nest. And that's what both determines some of our health, so whether we have enough water to drink, etc., but also provides us the stable foundation that we need in order to be able to construct things like economic systems, political systems, social systems that then give rise to the social determinants of health, things like housing, education, and income that we know make up so much of people's overall health status. And that being stable and having a lot of focused energy and organization and resource is what allows us to construct the very complex structures that are healthcare systems and make sure they're supplied with well-trained staff, make sure they have the actual pharmaceutical supplies and other medical supplies that they need. And so when I describe it like that, I find that people can understand that not only are the ecological determinants of health important in and of themselves, but they're required for everything else. And that if they go, everything, including the actual health structure, goes. And so when I describe that, I'll make sure to say that most of the evidence shows that actual health systems, hospitals, etc., are only responsible for about 25% of overall health outcome, and that everything else contributes to overall wellness. And you'll probably find that most people are surprised to hear that, partly because the doctorly professions have done such a good job of making ourselves seem important. So people think we are important, but really all of these other things contribute more to health than what we do in hospitals. And even that is totally dependent on what lies underneath. So I'll build it up with those layers. You can take a look at this image. And so it shows basically that planetary health nest. So if this is helpful to you, you can find it in that supplement. And so once you've described that, I'm really happy you're already talking about a target, because when we've been writing all these commentaries over the last years and decades, mostly we've been talking about a problem and we've been saying we need to do something. But when you think about how we solve clinical issues, we don't talk about the coronavirus crisis and say, we need to do something. We say, we did this, this happened to the patient, next time we're going to do this, and then we move on. Everything is very targeted and very case-based. And we talk about, we tell each other the stories of things that we did that really worked so that other people can do the same thing. We tell people the stories of things that didn't work so that people can avoid that or learn from our mistakes. And I like to think about change making in the same way. And so I'm glad that you've chosen a target already. So you want to stop the construction of this coal mine. And you've chosen that based on the evidence you know around the potential impact in terms of air pollution, the potential impact on the social determinants of health and well-being, traffic accidents, potential water pollution. And that all really makes sense. And so it seems to me that you've chosen a strategic target, and now you're looking to figure out, okay, well, what are the tactics that I need to employ now to devise, and what story do I need to tell in order to convince the decision makers and the population that this is a really bad idea, and to win this fight, basically. And so when we think about this, sometimes I'll think about it in terms of sub-targets. So you've got this big target. So maybe you can divide that up into sub-targets. Maybe you can be thinking about different tactics. And because sometimes it takes the one tactic, say you could write a letter, getting a bunch of doctors and healthcare professionals to say, hey, we think this is a bad idea, and then publish that in the media. That will get you some media. That's a win. And that will attract more team members to your cause. And once that power is magnified, then you can choose a bigger target or a bigger element of strategy. So I'll just show you a couple of the things that we've done that have been similar. So just to put this in context, pretty much around the world, we don't do the studies that we need to do into the health impacts or the environmental impacts of resource extraction projects. We tend to cite these projects next to vulnerable populations. So environmental racism is a real huge concern in Canada and in other places. So we tend to cite our coal projects next to Black communities. Our oil sands, our fracking projects are often next to Indigenous communities. And this is just a picture of two Indigenous leaders from the oil sands area who have traveled the world trying to get people to do a study into the local health impacts of resource extraction on their communities. And, you know, this is one of, frankly, my greatest sources of shame as a Canadian doctor, that I haven't managed to help this happen yet. And this is despite having incredible speakers, you know, Ariel Doranger, that's her giving the keynote at the American Public Health Association conference a couple of years ago. That's the biggest public health conference in the world. So she actually had the biggest platform in the world to talk about this element of public health, and it still hasn't happened. That's Francois Paulette giving a presentation at last year's summit, WHO Global Climate and Health Alliance Summit at COP, giving the same message. And so this was making headlines in Canada before the pandemic. I do think we're likely to get this done probably soon, but it hasn't happened yet. So the question is, okay, why? Because it's certainly not for shortage of them asking, and it's not for lack of me asking. But really, this is a big deal. This is Willow Thixon. She's now a resident physician, and she, you know, has been an incredible advocate. She's an Indigenous person from northern BC and Alberta. This is her talking about the fracking projects in the area of her community. So out of sight, out of mind is what she says. And she has so much get up and go. She managed to get, Enrique, you might have met her there. This is her in Edinburgh with her newborn. And us meeting with Richard. Yeah, you did. Hey, yeah. So she's one of these people who, you know, is just so effective and smart and passionate. But the reality is that she needs help and allies to help her magnify the message. And also, we need to recognize that we're up against like power. So this is a leaked memo, to just give you one example, from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, that was sent to the federal cabinet on, you can see March 27th there, 2020. And so this was sent to, and it's okay if this ends up in the recording because this made headlines, but it was sent to Kate first, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And, you know, we responded and I wrote a blog on it. But you can see that it starts at one point with the acknowledgement that I think they'd already had 2 previous meetings with cabinet prior to this letter being issued. And this is at the start of the pandemic. It was only March by then. So you can see how much lobbying they were doing. there was I've since looked at basically an audit of meetings with federal decision makers here in Canada that showed that over a 7-year period leading up to, I think it was about 2018, the fossil fuel industry had 5 times more meetings with federal decision makers and staff than did non-governmental organizations around the environment. So what we're up against is deep embedded influence of the fossil fuel industry within government and with our decision makers. So when I think about this, you know, we will never have as much money as they have for lobbyists. However, we have a lot more people. And so when I think about how I'm going to go about working, I'm always thinking about that ratio and how I can change it. Because we know from work that we've done, even with physicians, with pharmaceutical reps, that when doctors meet with a pharmaceutical rep, their prescription practices statistically change. That's what the studies show. And when you ask those doctors, when you met with the pharmaceutical rep, did your prescription practices change? They always say, no, like that might happen to someone else, but that doesn't happen to me. I prescribe based on evidence. So the thing is, everybody thinks they're the exception to the rule around evidence and influence. But the reality is that when we meet people, we generate a bond of trust. All sorts of neurochemicals are firing in our brain that we're not aware of. And we start to kind of like them, and we start to sort of, view their message in a friendly way. So it's not necessarily that people are bad people. They're just human. And we just need to acknowledge that we're human. And so when we're thinking about how to change this balance of influence, I'm just always thinking about those people. Okay, who makes the decision and how can I change their day so that they see more people like me than people like that? So just be thinking that in your head as you're going. The thing that absolutely enraged me about this letter, if you look at the middle bit there, it says, in addition to the flexibility in existing regulations, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers also recommends, whoopsies, that government adopt a do no harm principle with respect to regulations imposed on industry. I was like, I'm sorry, it's a global pandemic and you're asking that we do no harm to the fossil fuel industry? I had a little bit of a temper tantrum that day, I don't mind telling you. I think that was the day I decided to run for politics. I was so angry. And so when you're thinking about how you're going to change the balance of influence, it's really important to think about what message you're going to deliver. Your story, we know that numbers numb and stories stick. So the stories that you and your group can bring to that meeting with the decision maker or the interview with the media, and I think you're actually, like Enrique and Mayada, you both are good at storytelling. And so I think you've got some, a lot of skill to work with. We know that human empathy is most motivated by arguments around health, by arguments around children's health in particular. That's the argument that communicates across political lines better than almost anything else. We know that it matters what costume you're wearing when you're delivering that argument. So it's better to do this with your scrubs on or a stethoscope around your neck, even though it feels really cheesy. I know it feels super cheesy, but just pretend that you're an actor. Like if we were setting this as a drama on TV, we wouldn't have the doctor not in his costume, right? And there's reasons for that, because it elicits a different emotion in the audience. And that's what we have to be thinking about, those kinds of tools as well. And so I'm always thinking about what kind of emotion I'm generating in my audience. And so this is Marshall Ganz's methodology. He's a movement theory researcher out of Harvard. And so he talks about action inhibitors and action motivators. So inhibitors are things like inertia, which he feels can be overcome with stories that elicit a feeling of urgency. Other inhibitors are apathy, which can be overcome by anger. Fear can be overcome by hope. That really horrible sense of isolation that we often feel, like what are we going to do, can be overcome by solidarity, which is exactly what you're generating here. And a feeling of self-doubt can be overcome with stories of other doctors and organizations that have done similar things. And so as you move forward, think about, like very specifically think about, okay, if I was a playwright and I was writing the story of this, what emotions do I want to be generating in my audience? Are we going for outrage? Are we going for the urgency of now, climate change is a health emergency? Are we going for, we can make this huge change that will make a tremendous difference to the lives of our children? You have the power to make this difference now. Think about how you will feel in 2050, looking back at your gorgeous, beautiful trees in your town, at your clean air, at your healthy children. And think about how that will feel versus a town with smoggy buildings, children that we know are more likely to have mental health issues, lung issues if there's significant air pollution from the project. So think about how you're going to generate that solidarity. How do you purposefully generate solidarity so that nobody feels scared and alone who's working on this project? And how can you tell stories of what's worked in other places in order to help you? So think very carefully about that. So something that we did, which is a little bit similar, and we've done several of these types of things over the years. So we've had quite a few requests for health impact assessments into resource extraction projects. So we've done that with fracking projects and others, and have, basically written a letter that says, this is why you should have a health impact assessment, gotten a bunch of doctors to sign it, put that out in the media. Usually you have to write a commentary around that with a link to your open letter that people can click on. And then if you're lucky, you'll get some media around that. And then we actually helped to rewrite the national act around impact assessments. So that's been done now. We got some of what we wanted in there. We did a lot of contributions to that process. And that was helpful, I think. And then you come to these individual projects. So this time we weren't so much asking for a health impact assessment as we were pointing out that the one that was done was not good. And we were saying, look, this is in the context, and this was about an oil sands project, of us not having done studies to even figure out what the cumulative health impacts of all the other ones that we've done were. And so this was going to be another huge oil sands mine. You can see this was about a year ago now. And we had a whole bunch of, so this was quite a academically, I had actually tried to publish commentaries on this topic multiple times. It's hard to sometimes even get these types of this type of written work into journals, because the editorial advisory board is like asking themselves, like, do we want to take this risk? Or the editorial board, like, is it worth it to the journal to be all of a sudden talking about this very hot button issue? So I got all the way to, it looked like it was going to be published by a pretty big journal, and then it got cut at the very end by the editorial board, despite the fact that the senior editor was on board. So it just shows you that there's courage involved. There's the need to expend political capital, and not everyone's going to want to do that. And so there's different ways that solidarity can help with that. But in this case, I basically took that academic work, which I'd already had peer reviewed by all sorts of people in Canada, and made it into a letter. So this was a letter with something like 30 references, because I felt like it was a scary enough topic for doctors to interact with and researchers to interact with, that they would feel reassured that I'd done my homework if I had like 30 references and it was just bam, 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 bam. So that was how I approached this. I had some feedback on that. People said, this is way too nerdy and academic, but we got a lot of big names to sign it. So taking into account the fact that most of the docs you're going to try to involve in this, and the nurses and the allied health professionals, probably don't know what they don't know around climate change and health and planetary health and health impacts of coal, I would do their homework for them. And despite the fact that it's probably not the best in terms of messaging, I would write a really good evidence-based, nerdy report. And Mayara, I know you can do this. Enrique, I know you can too. And so then what I would do is use that, or you could, these are all potential tactics, use that, send it out, get people to sign it saying, look, we need a health impact assessment for all of these reasons. Then you end up with your Google Drive document that has all those signatures on it. And then you can write a commentary or an op-ed with more sort of simple language referring back to that letter. So you still have your decent communications for the public here, but the nerdy communications here. That's what I would suggest if that sounds like a tactic that would be worthwhile for you. So when we did that, so we got about 170 doctors to sign that. So it was a letter to the federal cabinet. And then the Premier of Alberta held a press conference. So Alberta is our most conservative province. It's where the oil sands are, that said that we didn't live in the real world. And it was all over the news, and he was mad. And then, so we felt like any news was better, like at least we were getting a reaction. And we got some media around that. And then actually another group of academics also put a letter out, and there were protests, and the Indigenous people in the area also were involved. And, you know, at this point, the finances of it all weren't looking very good. So I think all of that together just made the people in charge be like, look, it is not worth it to us at this moment in time with the way the finances are looking. And you could totally make that appointment, that point around coal, like the bottom's falling out of the coal market, right? And they canned the project. So I was sitting in Toronto a couple of days later about to present, and I think I was going to a Canadian Medical Association board meeting, and I checked my Twitter, and all of a sudden I see that they pulled their application. So in this case, it wasn't the federal cabinet that changed their decision or that made a decision. It was that the company just looked at it and saw this overwhelming amount of opposition and was like, it's not worth our time. And so there can be a number of different types of good outcomes. I think, you know, just talking about the costuming here, I said wear scrubs on TV. This is work we did around coal. So this was phasing out coal-fired power. So, you know, taking a sort of a page from that playbook, we talked in Ontario, or one of our biggest provinces, a coalition of community groups and health practitioners made the point that the air pollution, and it's best if you can have data around this, but I appreciate that your timeline's pretty tight. You might not be able to, that a lot of kids were ending up in the emergency department with asthma as a result of that. And so they were missing school, their parents were missing work. It was costing a whole bunch of money to the healthcare system. And it was that, and so they actually went around to municipalities. Girls, I'm sorry, I'm still making a presentation. Can you be quiet? My kids are home. Okay. So what happened was they got municipalities one by one, and you could do this with people. So you could go to, you know, the potential, can you be quiet? Like do that as quietly as possible. You could go to the potential candidates and get them to sign on one by one to say they won't do this. You could hold a public meeting once you published your stuff and invite the different candidates and say, hey, we're going to have a debate about this. We want you to make a commitment now in front of everybody that says, if you get elected, are you going to go ahead with this coal mine? And so that way, and say, we are going to publicize what you say. We're going to make it, we're going to broadcast it so everybody knows your position. We're going to walk door to door and make sure that everybody voting for you knows what you said here. And so what are you saying? And put real pressure on them to take a position. Pre-election, you've got some power because they want to get elected. And I think that it's a pretty good moment for you to be making a big stand on that. So what we ended up doing, so in Ontario, they went door to door, or well, community to community, went to the different political parties pre-election, got, I think they ended up all committing to phase out coal, and that's how it happened. And then we did something similar in Alberta using the same playbook. And in that case, I think it was Joe actually hosted the public meeting with the politicians. And again, most of them committed. I think there was one very right-wing party that didn't, but then they got elected. The people who committed to phase out were in power, and they put the phase out into motion. Once that was done, we took the same methodology with doctors from various provinces nationally, and we ended up achieving a national coal power phase out commitment. And then because doctors in the UK had been doing something similar and our two environment ministers got along, they founded the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and in fact invited Nick Watts to speak there, but he was busy that day, so I did. And so this was at COP a couple of years ago, but you can see that there's representatives, high-level representatives from multiple countries around there, and Catherine McKenna is just sort of out of range there. And they asked me they wanted someone from the health community to speak because we could speak to those patient impacts. So I was lucky that several members of my patient population were around the table. Elder Francois Paulette, who I showed in one of those previous slides, was there. Denny National Chief Bill Erasmus was there. And so I was able to say, look, like I live in the subarctic, I serve a population that extends all the way up to the high Arctic. We're one of the most rapidly warming places in the world. My representatives, my patients are here because this is a priority for them. We're seeing the ice melt, we're seeing food security challenges, mental health challenges. And when we think about coal itself, this is what happens with coal. And the man who was sitting next to me there, I think that was Chris Ballard from Ontario. He actually was the health minister or the environment minister in Ontario when they phased out coal there. And so I had thinking about props, I had a asthma puffer in my pocket. So I took out the asthma puffer and I said, this is what kids have to take if they are exposed to air pollution. And he was right next to me and he said, you know what? Everywhere I go in Ontario now, people tell me the kids have less asthma and we have way less smog alert days than we used to have. And so it's that individual level storytelling about the people who are really affected that the communication science tells us works. And in my experience, it's actually, like my personal experience backs that evidence base up. I do believe it is what works. And so what you can bring to the situation is your stories of either a climate change related impact. And I know Mayara and Enrique, you can tell stories around heat emergencies and how it's impacted your patients, and any kind of local toxicity patients you've had who haven't had access to clean air or clean water. Remember that people are moved by stories of one person more than they are moved by stories of groups of people. So if you can say, you know, my 6-year-old patient kept coming into my office with asthma because of the air in, you know, the city or in her house, that's going to change people's minds much more than if you say 72% of 12-year-olds are getting asthma exacerbations in these conditions. For whatever reason, the way our brains are made, we care more about the one person. I think maybe because we can identify with them more, we can sort of think about them as a member of our family more. And so just be aware that that's how human brains are wired. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, there's tons you can do to impact this. One way to help generate solidarity may be to help get some of your group to gather to take this pledge, or it could be something that you could think about doing later. I've really had we published it in the Lancet a little while ago, and it just talks about, I think that, you know, as we move from a health frame, a healthcare systems frame, to a planetary health nest frame, it really makes sense to be changing the oath that we tell ourselves about what our obligations are. So I love the way this ended up getting written. And my only regret is that it was for health professionals, because I actually think it could be taken by almost anybody, architects, urban planners, citizens. And I hope that a non-health professional oriented one will be written and put up, because I think it's really powerful to commit to solemnly pledge to dedicating your life towards the service of humanity and the protection of the natural systems on which human health depends. You could even invite your elected officials to potentially take it. There's lots of ways to kind of be mischievous about all of this. And those are, I think, what's going to help you achieve your goals. And really, solidarity is the most important, because I don't want to undermine how scary this stuff can be. When you're up against, like the day that I published that letter on the oil sands, I was very nervous, because some physicians have actually essentially been run out of town as a result of working on oil sands issues. There's a doctor named Dr. John O'Connor who made mention that he was worried about his patients downstream from the oil sands potentially getting increased levels of cancer as a result of water contamination. And he had 4 counts or something like that placed against his license. And he ended up having to spend 3 years clearing his name. He had to move. And what was interesting about that was that it actually created an activist from somebody who, in fact, is a very, very gentle man and had never done any environmental activism before, but it was so unjust that it exposed for him that deep influence of fossil fuel companies on state decision makers, which he felt to be so appalling that he's really dedicated a lot of his life since then to fighting it. So really, the more people you can have working with you, the safer you all are. And so I think that just really thinking about that and keeping in mind different ways of making sure that everybody feels protected is a real priority. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Can I ask you?
Easier. Yeah.
Where is the pledge published? It's beautiful. We should read it very carefully, each sentence. Where is it published?
It's in the Lancet. I know Enrique has the link.
Okay, we need that. And we need to translate that. I love translating. I can do it.
Yes, that's a
Perfect.
good idea.
Yeah, it's I've taken a couple of Zoom groups through it now, and actually very multidisciplinary. And even though there's a little bit of language around patients, a lot of the non-healthcare practitioners have found it very moving.
Courtney, so you'll be happy that we're already arranging for a pledge for all professionals
Awesome.
at the
Good.
São Paulo Planetary Health Alliance meeting.
Awesome.
And we actually sent a letter to the Lancet. Maybe they'll publish it. I don't know. Just arguing about that it should be for all professionals.
Enrique, have you turned off the record playing?
Okay, so we'll turn it off. Does anyone want to ask specifics about the Courtney's presentation? And then we turn off and move on.
Courtney, first of all, thank you very much. It was very insightful and very helpful for the movement here in Porto Alegre. And my question is fake news and misinformation, how to handle on this issue regarding phasing out coal?
So I think it depends on where you think people right now are getting their information. So we, as part of my recent political campaign, which is a whole thing, we actually engaged because we were doing it virtually, which, I mean, I'd never run any political campaign, let alone a virtual one. So we figured we'd better ask somebody who knew how to do that. And so we actually paid somebody, and she was in charge of Facebook analytics. And so I don't know if anybody has watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. Yeah, it looks like there's lots of people nodding, but I mean, that's a thing. And so what that means is that it's probably like, if you feel like a fair few people are getting their, at least a proportion of their information from Facebook, it's probably worth your while to pay for some Facebook ads, like to promote it, to create a little Facebook group, pay for some ads, you know, have some decent graphics. I think a really big part of this is coordinating with artists and with people who are good at visual communication, because the problem is you only get, like, you get this much attention. The expert we were working with told us that for videos, 45 seconds was it. So we were trying to make videos, you know, I was trying to get my whole story, my whole pitch of why people should vote for me.
We have Mayada.
Yeah, and she's good at that. Yeah, so it's really that's super, super important. I think like overall, I've been telling every board, every steering committee I'm part of, that we need to spend about 10,000% more on communications, because we can't keep writing. That's why you have to be thinking about who your audience is. So, you know, if you're writing a big nerdy letter and your audience is doctors and you want them to feel safe, you know, that's when you bust out the 12-point font and the 30 references. That's not going to fly on Facebook, right? So on Facebook,
Yeah.
you need something much more like, here, I'll just quickly share my screen again. You know, you need something like this. You need like a sentence with an arresting image, and you need to make sure there's people in that image, because the biggest mistake that we make when we're talking about climate change or environmental impacts is that we put just a picture of the environment, but the reality is people don't care about the environment. They care about the health of the people in the environment. So it's no mistake that there's two kids in this photo. Like I participated in the creation of this image, and I was very clear with the person who was putting the images together that we needed to be using evidence-based visual communications as well as evidence-based information. And so he actually went to the climate visuals. There's a climate visual site that is an evidence-based bank of visuals. And so it's got principles for visual communication, because they've done relatively extensive focus groups asking people like this image or this image, this image or this image. And so what they found is that we need to make sure that there's people in the image. And given that we know that things that talk about the health of children are the most persuasive, you probably want to have some kids in there. And
you know something about this image, Courtney, is that along with having kids in it, and you can feel, you can think about despair. At the same time, they seem playful and hopeful at the same time. So that's very interesting of this image. And I think we have to transmit both things at the same time.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yep. And you can see that there's solar panels in there too. So it's talking about the solution.
Yes.
And emphasizing something that's required of the group. So acting together. And why? Like, why would we act? Because then we win. And so it's possible to generate those kinds of things, but it takes, like, I find, you know, I can put at this point, I can rattle off a 3-page 30 reference thing in like 4 hours. Putting together something like this can take days. And it's just because it requires such a balance of image, message, thinking about your audience. And if you want to do it well, you get somebody who understands how to test different messages in different groups on Facebook. So you will, so during my campaign, they came up with 3 that they thought might be good.
What are you running for? Tell us.
Oh, this was in the summer. So I ended up coming 3rd, but I was running to be the head of the Green Party in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, I learned a lot. I learned that people really care how much money you raise. So next time I would start with that. I was like, no, I need to finish the policy paper. They're like, no, you need to raise money. I'm like, no, I really want to get this right. So, you know, this is, we all have our nerdy past that we need to overcome. But anyway, I didn't do badly for somebody who had never done it before. But what I learned is that, yeah, attention to Facebook. And if there's anybody you know who's done it before, that would be very helpful, because there's quite a strategy around it. And yeah, when we did it, it involved, for every important step, producing about 3 different options and then sending them out to a small proportion of the audience we had identified as being the subsegment of Facebook users that we thought would care. And then we would see which one generated the most clicks. And then we would pay to have that more successful image go out to the full group. So really, there's a tremendous number of stages at which attention to the evidence base of its sort is really important. So with the original information, with the narrative communications, with the visual communications, and then having a data-driven message delivery strategy. You can see that there's actually quite a few different steps there. And I know you're sort of short of time, so exactly like how many of those you do and what you do and how complex you get will depend on, you know, how many people on your team and how much bandwidth you have in the middle of a pandemic. But those are sort of things to keep in mind. And really, anytime you can get a meeting with people, even if it's virtual, the better, because that personal connection really builds a lot of trust and changes minds.